Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video on YouTube to help you improve your chess game. We're going to do a combination of things today. We're going to talk about a book review, we're going to talk about evaluation, we're going to talk about analysis, we're going to talk about finding better moves. All that in one video. Let's see how ambitious we can get. Alright, so what I did was pick out 3 random positions from one of the test chapters in the new book, Evaluate Like a Grandmaster by Grandmaster Perelshteyn and FIDE Master Solon. And I picked out a chapter where they actually give you 2 different moves to choose from, and then you have to evaluate both moves and compare your evaluation. But I thought I would try it without knowing what those 2 moves are, so that we could just look at the position. I think in each of the 3, I think the first position is white to play, the second position is white to play. Yeah, they're all white to play. And we're going to see what we can find. And we're going to compare what we could do as a good player with what weaker players do. And one of my earlier videos, which won an award, we talked about the different ways to make better chess moves. And some people think that's a joke, that there's only one way to make a better chess move. But actually, a lot of people think memorizing a lot of positions so that you just recognize patterns like more openings and more endgames is the main way to play a better chess move. But actually, of course, in most positions, you can't play from memory like that. Most positions you have to analyze and evaluate, hence our emphasis today on evaluation. And you have to compare moves, and that's a skill in finding better chess moves. So actually in most positions, you're not knowing better chess moves, you're not knowing them, so you have to find them. So the 2 main ways to play better chess moves are to memorize more, but more likely it's going to be to analyze and evaluate and choose them better by finding them by analysis. Now, there's other ways that you can play better chess moves, as I mentioned in the earlier video, which is become more consistent so that you're doing things the right way, or you're following your principles where you weren't following them before. Or maybe you have better stamina so that you can play better moves later in the game. Or maybe you're using better time management so later in the game you have adequate time. Or early in the game you can recognize critical positions and spend more time on critical positions and less time on less critical positions. So there are more ways to play better chess moves than just to memorize more openings or endgames. Okay, in this position it's white's move. And I don't know what the 2 moves are that they gave us to look at, but let's see if we can find some candidate moves. Well, first of all, am I going to use my memory in this position? Well, this is not like a lot of positions that I've seen. It's vaguely similar. I notice whenever I have a pawn on h5 that I can open up the h file by playing h takes g6. So that's a candidate move, but in this position I don't have a rook on the h file. So even though opening up the h file is generally a good candidate idea, in this particular position it's not as important as it would be if I had a rook there, but it's still got to be a candidate move. So one move we could look at is h takes g6. What else could white play? Well, he's got the bishop pair, which means he has 2 bishops and black doesn't. It doesn't mean he has 2 bishops. The bishop pair is short for the advantage of the bishop pair, which means one side has it and the other side doesn't. Alright, so what else could white play? Well, his rook on b5 is a little awkward. In fact, if he didn't have that bishop on e3, then black would be threatening queen takes b5, c takes b5, rook takes c1 check. And he would get 2 rooks for the queen with good command of the queen side. But in this position, if it was black's move and he played queen takes b5, c takes b5, rook takes b1 check, then after bishop takes c1, rook takes c1 check, king h2, he would only get a rook and a bishop for the queen, which is probably not enough, although his other pieces would be pretty good. So that wouldn't be totally hopeless. So one idea here for white is to stop things like that by, maybe getting that rook off of b5, maybe playing, something like rook to somewhere else. But he has to watch out, because if he puts his rook on a random square, then he's just losing his c4 pawn. So one idea here, of course, would be for white to play something like b3 and try to protect the pawn on c4 so that he could move the rook on b5. Although after b3, knight to c5, that rook on b5 is running out of moves, although there aren't any black pieces around that could really attack it. The knight can't attack it from c5 very easily. So b3 is a candidate move. to shore up the c4 square. Black can also play knight e5, which hits the pawn on c4 the third time. So the pawn on c4 is a little loosey-goosey. White could play rook to b4 to just guard the pawn and hit the pawn on a4, but the rook on b4 is a little bit loose itself. It's on the same color square as the bishop. It's not guarded by anything, so rook to b4 is a candidate move, but it's probably not a strong one. Let's ask ourselves a question. If white plays h takes g6, does black have to take back, or does he have an intermediate move? Could he play queen takes b5 maybe first? And then if white plays g takes f7 check, then after black gets out of check and eventually white captures on b5, he could go for that rook and bishop for the queen? Probably not. I don't see that black can easily not recapture on g6, but the question is, how does taking on g6 help white? Well, it means there's one less pawn to guard. He doesn't have to worry about the rook on b5 or the queen on e2 guarding h5, but black's not really threatening g takes h5 anyway. White could play h6 and attack the bishop, but what does that do? The bishop would just go to another square on the diagonal, let's say f6, and then the pawn on h5 could be weak in the endgame. It might be good in the middle game. Not so clear there. Can he neutralize that bishop in some way? Can he play a move like bishop to g5, threatening bishop takes e7? If he does, black can pretty easily neutralize the bishop on g5 by playing a move like knight e5, which allows the rook on c7 to guard e7. And now black's again got all those pieces attacking the c4 square. So h takes g6 is reasonable. b3 probably is very reasonable. That way the queen doesn't have to guard b2. If white did play b3, what would black play? He could play a3, but that would take all the pressure off the light squares, and then that pawn on c4 is pretty strong. He could play a takes b3, a takes b3, and then try to penetrate with his queen somehow, maybe queen to a3, hitting the rook on c1, which is guarded by the bishop on e3, maybe being able to bring the other bishop down somewhere. Okay, so it's white's turn. We have to evaluate the position. Well, the bishop pair is worth something. Oh, here's another candidate move. We could play bishop to h3. I've seen this played in some positions and actually some of my games. So here I am switching from analysis to memory. Bishop h3 pins the knight to the rook, and it's a little bit awkward because the knight would love to move to go to some of these stronger squares. And if the rook goes off of the c8 square, that takes the pressure off the c4 pawn. Also, we have to point out that rook takes c4 might be a threat in some of these lines. If white plays like nothing, black can play rook takes c4, and then after rook takes c4, he can play queen takes b5. But then white has rook takes c8 check. So it looks like rook takes c4 to remove the guard, rook takes c4. Queen takes b5 doesn't work because of the check. All right, so let's go back to look at bishop h3. Bishop h3, if the knight moves, there's no great square for the knight, then bishop takes c8 is okay. If the rook moves off of c8 to get out of the pin, then the pressure's off of c4. What else could black play? If he plays f5, white's got that square attacked 3 times. It's only guarded once. Doesn't look very safe. Let's say he plays e6 after f5. After bishop h3, e6, bishop h3, e6. Now the d pawn is getting a little weak. The dark squares have gotten a little weaker. The bishop is probably a little better off on h3 than it was on g2, although after e6 it's nothing special. The problem with e6 though for white is, how do you get that rook on b5 back into the game? If you play bishop h3, e6, the pawn on e6 is now guarding the d5 square, and the rook can't go back to d5 and then come back into the middle if you need the rook to do that. Now, as I said, the rook on b5 is a little precarious right now, but at least black doesn't have any minor pieces that can harass it. How about sacrificing a pawn with e5? If we play e5, black can just take it, and then we can't take the pawn on b7 because it's guarded by a rook and the queen. So e5 is a move to open up lines, but it doesn't really seem to do that much. So h takes g6 remains a move, bishop h3 remains a move, b3 remains a move. Rook to d5 to get the rook back in the game probably is not a move because of rook takes c4. Doesn't look right. So I'm guessing that among the two moves they gave us would be b3, h takes g6, and bishop h3. Let's look at the book and see which of the two moves they asked for. h6 and h takes g6. All right, we didn't discuss h6. I said I didn't think it did that much. But in the long run, if you have a pawn on h6, you can create some problems on the king side if you can get your pieces over there faster. So h6 versus h takes g6, now that we know that's their question, which one evaluates better? Well, h6, where would the bishop go? I assume he would go maybe to f6. Then I guess white could go for g4, g5, or maybe g4, f4, g5, and try to take away the bishop's squares. I'm not sure that that's fast enough, but it's not ridiculous to do that. So h6, if he plays bishop e5 right away, then white would certainly play f4, and then on bishop f6 he could play g4, and then if bishop h4, white could play g5, and that bishop on h4 has no way to get back into the middle, could lose the bishop to a move like queen g4 later. So h6, he could play bishop h8. Bishop h8, he only has one diagonal now. Or one direction, I should say, out of the normal four directions. So that does close off the line. We already said that h takes g6 is not bad, but without a rook on the h file, is it really better than h6? So that's what they're asking us. Obviously, I don't know the answer. I would have told you. Both of them look okay to me. I don't see that black's in any big danger with either one. Let's take a look at h6 again. If I can make him play bishop h8, I guess that's good. If he plays bishop to f6 and I play g4, threatening g5 and f4, maybe then I could start a kingside attack with f5, although if I ever play f5, he's going to stick that knight on e5, and that's going to be a really good knight. h6, bishop, I don't know, bishop f6, g4. Can black play something like knight e5 hitting the pawn on c4? Then if g5, knight takes c4, hits the rook on b5, that gets pretty complicated. We don't have to do that, of course. h6, bishop f6, g4, knight e5. Instead of playing g5 right away, we could just play b3. And he can't play knight takes g4, everything's safe. But he could play knight takes, well, as he said, I'm playing b3 to stop knight takes c4. All right, so my guess is that h6 is okay. We can harass him a little bit if we can get his bishop to go back to f8 or h8. That's an advantage. And otherwise, f6 and e5 give us some chance to push our pawns on the king side. But we do have to watch out for the queen side. As we said, there's a lot of lines on the queen side where there's a problem. My guess is h takes g6, which is normally what you want to do, isn't any better. So I would say, because of his bishop pair, even though he has the awkward rook, and white has more pieces on the king side, I would say white's a little better here. I would say maybe h6 is a little better than h takes g6. Let's take a look at the back of the book and see what they say. I'm sure they checked it with the computer, so I don't have to do that. It's problem number 13 in chapter 6. All right. h6, exclamation point. This is Carlson Iturrizaga 2014. Carlson executed a strategy now popularized by the neural network engines of boxing in the enemy king on g8. Where's the checkmate, you may ask? Take a look at what happened next. All right, so I did pick out h6 as being a little bit better. He said white has an advantage, but it's not necessarily winning. Let's turn on the engine. Mr. Engine, what do you say? engine says b3 is a candidate, b4 is a candidate, h6 is a candidate. It doesn't necessarily say that h6 is better than b3. It says they're both way better for white. The engine thinks that white has a bigger advantage than they do in the book, and certainly a bigger advantage than I thought of. Let's see how the game ended. h6, bishop h8. We already explained why he did that, because he can harass the bishop on the other squares. And now b4. A takes b3, en passant. A takes b3. Knight c5. Queen to d1 looks like a real Carlsen kind of move, just overprotecting that pawn on b3 and overprotecting the rook. Knight goes back to d7, not sure why. Bishop h3, that's that idea. I said that's one of the few things I did from memory, is look at that idea. He moves the rook out of the pin into the open file. Carlsen gives up his bishop pair to get rid of that strong knight. Now he gets rid of the bishop, bishop d4, with eyes that if the bishops are traded, he can get his queen on that diagonal. Bishop takes, queen takes. Now black has to stop the diagonal. He plays f6, and white plays e5. And of course the idea is if f takes e5, rook takes e5, and we have a sneaky pin, and then if d takes e5, white could play queen takes d7 with a big advantage. It says white pried open the king side and won shortly. It said if instead you take the pawn on the first move, if you take the pawn, then white only has a slight advantage. Pushing the pawn to h6 gives white a much bigger advantage. All right, let's do the next puzzle. Let's go over here to my... All right, so black has obviously just played c takes d4 in the next puzzle. So it's white's turn. Well, white has to recapture. Let's look at this as people at sort of different levels, like I did in my earlier videos called 700, 1200, 1700, 2200. If we use general principles and we hand wave, we could say, just take toward the middle. So play c takes d4, hit clock. But a better player would look at this and say, well, but my bad piece is my bishop on c1, and my e3 pawn is in the way, and if I take with the e pawn, it opens up my bishop on c1, so maybe I should take with the e pawn to make my bishop much stronger. But then we could go up another level and say, well, that's hope chess. If we play e takes d4, we just lose a pawn with queen takes f4, and that's no good. All right, well, that may be true, but then you actually have to look deeper because you have a discovered attack on the queen, and maybe you can do something with it. So you have to look at this a little deeper on that. E takes d4. If he plays queen takes f4, do we have any place where we can move our knight to trap his queen? Well, no. If we play knight to e4, he can always move his queen back on the diagonal. He can play queen back to c7 again. And he doesn't have any loose pieces that we can take off. We can play knight takes f6 check and double his pawns, but so what? So I think e takes d4, queen takes f4 is probably okay. All right, but we have another way to take back. We could play knight takes d4. What about knight takes d4? We have to compare that with c takes d4. Or do we have a Zwischenzug? Maybe we could play a third move. Do we have any third move that we could play? Can we attack his queen? Can we check him? No, 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 no. Doesn't look like we have a fourth move. So already e takes d4 looks questionable because the queen takes f4. And even though you get a discovery on the queen, since you're not really trapping the queen or winning a lot of tempos, I don't think that that's worth it. So the safe moves are c takes d4 and knight takes d4. Well, on c takes d4, on general principles, we have another pawn in the middle, but that gives his knight the b4 square. Can he take advantage of that? Let's see. C takes d4. We can't just play it on general principles. We have to analyze lines. Let's say he goes after my bishop with knight to b4. I can't play queen to a4 check because his knight on b4 is guarded by the bishop on f8, and he could just play bishop to d7 and hit my queen, so queen a4 check is not a possibility. That means I have to move the bishop. Where would I go? Well, if I go back to b1, that's not terrible, but if he could then put a bishop or a queen on the diagonal, he could stop me from castling, but he can't do that right away. So after c takes d4, knight to b4, bishop to b1, if he plays something like b6, I could play castle, And then if he plays bishop a6, I could play rook to e1. Then he might get the d3 square for his pieces. But I don't have to put the bishop on b1. I could keep the bishop on the diagonal. I could play c takes d4, knight b4, bishop e2. Aha, but that's no good because he has knight takes c2 check. Whoa, now we have some interesting pros and cons here. If we play e takes d4, he plays queen takes f4. If we play knight takes d4, our pawn on e3 is weak. He has two center pawns to my one. But if we play c takes d4, he plays knight b4, and now I have to play bishop b1, unless I want to give up the bishop here. I guess I could move my knight and play knight to, I don't know, b3 or something. But then he has knight takes d3 check, queen takes d3, and then he could get the bishop on that diagonal pretty quickly anyway. So I'm not all that happy about giving up the bishop pair with c takes d4, knight b4, and then moving my d2 knight. Also, if I move my d2 knight, he can play bishop to b4 check. And it's hard for me to put pieces in the way because it interferes with my queen guarding my bishop on d3. So let's look at that again. C takes d4, knight b4, bishop b1, b6. If I play a3, what would he play? Would he play knight to c6? I guess I could get away with that. C takes d4, knight b4, bishop b1. I'm threatening to castle. If he plays b6, threatening bishop a6, I could play a3. He can't play bishop a6 because of a takes b4, winning a piece. So he's got to bring the knight back. That might give me time to castle. All right, one last time. C takes d4, knight b4, bishop b1, b6, a3, knight c6, castles, bishop a6, followed by maybe rook to e1 or rook f2 or something. So I guess that's okay for white. Knight takes d4 looks shaky. In the long run, my e3 pawn is weak. I guess I'm threatening knight to b5, but he could always play like a6. Can I then play e4? I can't because my f4 pawn is still hanging. So after knight takes d4, I'd have to play an early move with my other knight so that my bishop could guard f4 if I ever move my e-pawn up to break with e4. It looks a little awkward. It just looks positionally suspect to take with a knight. Taking with a knight is probably tactically easier than taking with the c-pawn. Taking with e-pawn doesn't look right. Let's see what moves they give in the book to look at. They don't even look at knight takes. They look at e takes versus c takes. Well, since they're saying about e takes, there must be something that we should look at with regard to queen takes f4. Let's look at that one more time. E takes d4, queen takes f4. Looks like black wins a pawn. If I play something like knight c4, he just plays queen to c7. What did white get out of that? He could put a knight on e5, big deal. No, he can't. There's no pawn on f4 to save it. The knight on c4 is hanging. If I play knight to e4, my knight on e4 would be hanging. I just don't see the advantage of sacrificing that pawn. So my guess is c takes d4 might be a little awkward, but let's take toward the middle. This is Van Vliet against Znasko Borovsky. I'm not sure who Van Vliet is. 1907. Let's see what the answer is. The answer is Van Vliet didn't want him to play knight to b4, and he took with the e-pawn and sacked the pawn, and he did play knight e4. All right, well, Van Vliet saw something I didn't. Let's see what he saw. The engine agrees. The engine's been running, of course. The engine says pawn takes, queen takes, knight e4, queen c7. We saw this line, knight f6 check, g takes f6, castle. And it thinks white has more than enough compensation for the pawn. The engine says that black is perfectly even with no problems. But the engine also says if you take with a c-pawn, which is why they chose this for the book, of course, then knight to b4, bishop to b1, and they want to play bishop to d7. That's the move, is to get the bishop on the diagonal faster. So bishop d7, a3, and then rook c8, hitting the bishop that's not guarded by the rook anymore. And the engine says white should play a takes b, queen takes c1, and black's even better than he was if you had sacked the pawn. So it actually says that saving the pawn in this case is worse than sacrificing the pawn, and playing down a pawn, which gives you some play, is better than having this awkward play where you didn't lose the pawn, but black is getting better play here. So even though it looks like a beginner mistake to take with the e-pawn, I didn't think that taking with the e-pawn, was the right move, but it wasn't because I just looked at it and said he couldn't take the pawn. I looked further and I saw the line we looked at with the engine, and I evaluated that as okay for black, and the engine says it is okay for black. The engine said, but the problem is the other move is even better for black. I thought the other move was okay for black too, and I thought I would rather be equal in pawns where it's okay with black than sacrifice the pawn where it's okay for black. But obviously that wasn't the right answer. All right, we have one more puzzle. We don't have a lot of time. Let's do it a little quicker. Third puzzle. Which way to take the bishop? Well, if you're a low-rated player and you say, oh, I'm going to just take this way and open up my bishop. Okay, well, that does open up your bishop. Or you could be an intermediate player and say, I know what to do. You always take toward the center. So you should play g takes f3 and do that. Well, neither of those answers is off the top of your head right for those reasons. That would be hand waving. You actually have to analyze the position and see what's going to happen if you do those moves. All right, so let's say you play e takes f3. If black plays knight takes e5 and white plays a move like queen e2, then black could play probably queen to e7, threatening knight to d3 check, or d3. So let's look at that again. E takes f3, knight takes e5. What if we just develop our bishop? If we play bishop b5 check, he just plays knight c6. And we just lost our e-pawn. But let's see, we have 6 pawns. But we were up a pawn anyway, so we were going to lose that pawn. Is this some sort of Albin counter gambit, it looks like? Could be an Albin counter gambit. Let's turn off the engine. We don't want the engine telling us answers. Mr. Engine. All right, so if we take with the e-pawn, he plays knight takes e5, queen e2, queen e7. Doesn't look anything special. Take with the e-pawn, he plays knight takes e5. We play bishop b5 check. If he plays bishop d7, we could trade bishops and then castle. That looks okay, but black has that nice passed d-pawn for the middle game. If we take with the g-pawn, and he plays knight takes e5, we could then play bishop g2. Could he play something like queen to h4 and start harassing my king side then? That's a good question. G takes f3, knight takes e5, bishop g2. Queen h4 is a move. He could also just guard his d-pawn with something like knight c6 or bishop c5. I guess in some lines I could play f4 for white. So g takes f3, knight takes e5, bishop g2. He can also, after queen h4, in some lines he can play bishop d6 and threaten knight f3 check and mate. I guess white can play f4 in some of those lines to stop that. It's pretty murky. G takes f3, knight takes e5, bishop g2, queen h4, f4. Then he has knight g4, threatening f2 and h2. That doesn't look good. I don't know. I hate to play the game where I just give him the passed d-pawn. Then I have nothing to show for it. E takes f3, knight takes e5, bishop b5 check. Let's say knight c6 castles. Maybe I can do something to his king, but he could play bishop d6, rook e1 check, knight ge7. But somehow I get the feeling that taking with the e-pawn is just safer because my king looks like it's going to be in some trouble without my knight on the king's side. So I'm going to guess that taking with the e pawn is better here. Even though I hate giving him that extra pawn in the middle. All right, so this game is a training game with somebody in 2022. All right, let's see what the answer is for number 17. E takes f3, exclamation point. Okay, well, let's turn on the engine again. Did I miss something here? Oh, I gave him an extra bishop on the board. That was dumb. I set up the board wrong. All right, let's fix the position. For those of you who noticed that I gave him 2 bishops when I set up the board, we'll fix it. All right, Mr. Board Editor, take off the board, study, YouTube channel. That was dumb. All right, so in this position, all my analysis remains the same, except that I'm not down a bishop because he doesn't have 2 white bishops. That was silly. I was actually analyzing the position as if it was going to be even. I just forgot when I set it up, I put the extra bishop on the board. That's funny, but everything I said remains true, and the engine says if you take with the g pawn, you're up by 4/10 of a pawn, but if you take with the e pawn, you're up by more. In this position it says queen a5 check, but then we could play knight d2 or bishop d2. Let's say he plays knight takes. Then I said bishop checks, and now if he plays knight c6, I said castle. He can't play bishop. Well, yes, he can play bishop d6 because queen takes d4, bishop takes h2 check. So let's take a look at that. Bishop to d6. It says white should just play g3. If black plays knight e7, now you take the pawn. All right, so you're threatening to take the pawn here, and he has to save it. The engine says he doesn't have any great way to do that. If he plays bishop c7, so the queen guards it, it says play f4. And now if knight e7, play knight d2. If he castles, play knight f3. This pawn is weak. White's king is in good shape. He's got the bishop pair. And this is solid. So I had the right answer even though I had the position set up wrong. And I had the right answer for pretty much the right reasons. Bishop on c8 doesn't exist. Okay, very funny. All right, well, let's talk about what we should have talked about from the start, which is the name of the new book is Evaluate Like a Grandmaster by Grandmaster Perelshteyn and FIDE Master Solon. It's a unique book like that. I have a book called Elements of Positional Evaluation, but that's mostly about evaluating how the pieces get their power. That's the subtitle, which is what makes a bishop good? Why is a bishop and a knight worth about the same? All those kind of questions are in my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation. This book is about evaluating entire positions. So it's called Evaluate Like a Grandmaster. It's copyright 2022. I was nice enough to be given a review copy by FIDE Master Solon. And I can recommend the book. Very good. I am going to sign off. If you like the channel, you can subscribe, you can like the video, but the best thing you can do, as always, is tell your friends about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess. See you next time. Bye.